The body hit the stone courtyard like God had dropped something he no longer wanted. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Not the guards. Not the guests frozen on the terrace above. Not the string quartet, whose last note hung in the warm Calabrian air like it was embarrassed to disappear. Then Marco Ricci stood up. That was the part nobody could explain afterward. Not the tackle. Men had done braver things for worse reasons. Not the fall, 8 feet onto stone, the kind of landing that rearranges things inside you permanently. What nobody could explain, what the guards talked about in low voices for months afterward, was that he stood up immediately. Like the decision had been made before the pain arrived. Like his body had simply not been consulted on the matter. Blood ran freely from the split above his left eyebrow, tracking a dark line down the side of his face. His left shoulder sat at an angle that made people look away. He turned, slowly, with the deliberate care of someone calculating exactly how much he could move, and he put himself between Sophia Calabrese and the door at the top of the courtyard steps. He had no weapon. He had nothing but the wreckage of himself and the particular quality of his stillness, and he stood there and waited, and the look on his face was so absolutely, unervingly calm that 3 of the Dawn's guards, arriving at a dead run with weapons drawn, slowed involuntarily when they saw it, as if they'd run toward chaos and found, instead, a man who had already finished deciding how things were going to go. Sophia stood at the broken balcony railing above, chestnut hair loose from its arrangement, one hand gripping the stone so hard her knuckles had gone white, honey-brown eyes fixed on the bleeding, ruined young man below her. She had been to the theater in Milan. She had read every Russian novel her Swiss tutors assigned. She believed, in the abstract, that she understood what courage looked like. She had never seen it from 8 feet above, standing in candlelight, with a dead man at its feet. Signorina. One of the guards, moving past Marco, reaching up toward her. Come inside. Please. Sophia didn't move. Her eyes stayed on Marco. And Marco, who had been avoiding her eyes with practiced discipline since the age of 14, looked directly back at her. Just for a moment. Just long enough. Then his legs decided they'd done enough, and 2 guards caught him before he hit the ground a second time.
If you are new here, this story is going to ruin you in the best possible way. Hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who deserves it, because what happens next is just getting started. Now let's begin.
The marble knew her knees. 20 years of the same floor, the same circular motion, the same lavender-scented water turning gray by mid-morning. And still Elena Ricci polished it like it owed her something. Her wrist rotated in wide and even arcs. Her back was straight. Her face held the particular blankness of a woman who had learned, through long and costly practice, that the mind could travel anywhere while the hands still stayed useful. The foyer chandelier, 3 tiers of Murano glass, restored twice in Elena's time here, scattered morning light across the pale stone in fragments. She watched the patterns shift as a door opened somewhere deep in the palazzo. Voices, then footsteps. Then silence returning like water filling a shape. She wrung the cloth over the bucket and moved 6 inches to the left. Her left wrist caught the light. The bracelet was gold, delicate, and old, the kind of old that precedes fashion and outlasts it. It clinked once, soft as a breath, against the rim of the bucket. Elena didn't look at it. She never really looked at it directly anymore. It simply existed at the edge of everything she did, the way a bruise exists at the edge of a fingerprint, shaped by the hand that made it, carrying the record of the pressure long after the pressure has gone. The kitchen door at the far end of the foyer swung open, and Marco came through it backwards, balancing a crate of fresh citrus against his hip, while using his shoulder blade to push the door wide. He was 19 years old and already moved through the estate with the quiet precision of someone who had studied its angles for so long that the geometry had become instinct. His shirt was plain white linen, rolled at the elbows. There was a small ink stain on his left index finger from something he'd been reading the night before. He saw his mother on her knees and didn't say anything. He set the crate down by the kitchen pass-through, pulled a single blood orange from the top, and placed it on the floor beside her bucket without breaking stride. Elena looked at the orange, then up at her son's retreating back. "Have you had breakfast?" she asked. He looked over his shoulder and shook his head. "No, but neither have you." She picked up the orange, held it for a moment, the warmth from his hands still in the skin. Then she set it in her apron pocket and kept polishing. Marco had already gone. A few minutes later, Francesca, the undercook, was complaining about the pastry order when Marco came back through. 40 sfogliatelle by 7, and Bernardo sends me the ricotta. Late, again. And when I say late, I mean yesterday late. I mean the kind of late that has its own zip code. The delivery's at the East Gate, Marco said, already reaching for his jacket on the hook. Senior Bernardo's van has a broken rear axle. It's obvious he couldn't make the hill. Francesca stared at him. How do you know that? I saw him waving from the bottom road when I came in this morning. He looked embarrassed about it. Marco was already at the back door. I'll bring it up. And with that, he was gone again, and Francesca turned back to her worktop, shaking her head in the particular way she reserved for Marco. Not frustration exactly. Something closer to exasperated affection. The boy absorbed information the way good stone absorbed heat, quietly, completely, and for far longer than seemed reasonable. The kitchen girls had a theory that Marco Ricci had been born with some extra sense that registered the estate's entire operational state the way other people registered weather. He knew before anyone when a supply was short, when a generator was cycling wrong, when the men at the table had been meeting longer than usual, and the mood on the ground floor would be difficult by evening. He never announced this knowledge, though. He simply appeared at the point of friction, already carrying whatever was needed. The guards called him the Ghost. Marco had heard this. He neither confirmed it nor denied it. He didn't particularly love the name. Ghosts, in his understanding, were things that lingered in places they no longer belonged. He had decided some years ago that when he left this estate, it would be because he had somewhere better to go, not because he was haunting something. He was halfway across the courtyard with the ricotta when he heard her laugh. He didn't stop walking. He didn't look up, but his step fractionally, almost imperceptibly, slowed. Sophia Calabrese was standing on the upper terrace with her tutor, a thin Florentine woman who had been trying to get through Kant's critique of pure reason with her for 3 months without visible progress. Sophia was laughing at something the woman had said. Not her usual public laugh, the one she deployed at dinner with her father's associates, the warm and perfectly gauged laugh of a girl who understood that social grace was a form of currency. This was different. This came up through her like water through stone, slightly surprised by itself and slightly out of control. Marco shook his head, making sure his gaze didn't climb up to the terrace, and he carried the ricotta through the kitchen door. They had not spoken in over 8 months. But the silence between them had roots that went back further than 6 months. It had roots that went back to a Tuesday in October, 7 years ago, when Sophia Calabrese turned 13 and came down to breakfast in a dress her father had chosen, with her hair pinned the way her Swiss governess had shown her, and walked past Marco in the foyer without stopping. Not rudely or coldly, but with the specific, careful neutrality of a girl who had been taught, recently and thoroughly, what stopping would mean. Marco had been 12. He had been holding a bowl of sfogliatelle he'd saved from the kitchen because she'd mentioned the week before that Francesca's batch was her favorite. He stood in the foyer with the bowl going slowly cold in his hands and watched her continue up the stairs toward the breakfast room, and he understood. The way children understand things that adults have not yet found the words to explain, that something had ended. Before that Tuesday, they had been inseparable in the way that only children who share a secret can be. The estate's below-stairs world belonged to both of them equally. The warren of stone corridors behind the kitchen, the lemon grove at the eastern wall where you could sit in the branches and see the sea, the gap in the cellar wall that led to a forgotten room full of someone's abandoned century-old correspondence, which they had read to each other in dramatic voices for 3 consecutive summers. Sophia had given the letter writers elaborate fictional backstories. Marco had kept score of which ones were in love and which ones were just pretending. They had argued about it with the absolute conviction of people for whom the stakes are entirely real. He had taught her to whistle using 2 fingers, which she was terrible at, and she refused to admit. She had taught him French, unofficially, in the Lemon Grove, using a children's textbook she'd outgrown and a methodology that was mostly just correcting his pronunciation with increasingly exasperated sighs. "You keep swallowing the last syllable," she had said about 40 times. "I keep swallowing because you keep laughing when I say it correctly," he said, "which makes me sort of conscious, and that's what makes me swallow the last syllable." "I'm not laughing at you," she corrected. "Then what are you laughing at?" he asked quietly. She'd thought about it seriously. "I'm laughing at the fact that you're the only person I know who gets embarrassed about things, and then gets annoyed about being embarrassed, as if the embarrassment was a personal insult." He had looked at her for a moment. That's very specific, he murmured under his breath. I've known you since I was 5, she said, rolling her eyes to further cement her point. 5-year-old Sophia, white nightgown at the top of the kitchen stairs, watching Elena's hands move through pastry dough with the focused reverence of someone witnessing a small miracle. Marco had been 4 years old and had offered her a piece of stolen dough without asking her name first, and she had eaten it without asking his. The friendship had been established on those terms, mutual, wordless, completely without ceremony, and it had stayed that way for 8 years. Until the Tuesday in October when she walked past him in the foyer with her hair pinned and her face arranged and her eyes carefully not finding his. He set the bowl of sfogliatelle on the foyer table and went back to the kitchen. He didn't bring food upstairs again. The transition was not instantaneous. There were weeks of negotiation, of almost moments that didn't quite resolve. A glance across the courtyard that lasted a beat too long. A morning when Sophia appeared at the kitchen door in her school clothes and then seemed to remember something and turned back before she reached it. Marco watched these moments with the particular attentiveness of someone filing evidence they don't yet know how to use. He didn't push. He had his mother's instinct for understanding which silences were asking to be broken and which were asking to be respected. And this one was clearly asking to be respected. So he respected it. And then he stopped expecting it to change. And then it was 6 years later, and the distance between them had become the natural order of things. The maid's son on one side of it, the Don's daughter on the other, and 7 years of lemon groves and French lessons and stolen sfogliatelle existing in the space between them like something preserved in amber. Perfect, untouchable, and no longer alive. The staff noticed. They noticed everything and had decided to say absolutely nothing, because the staff always said nothing. But Francesca watched Marco's jaw set slightly tighter on Sunday mornings and filed it away next to the bowl of pastry he'd set on the foyer table 6 years ago, which she'd found cold, untouched, and quietly devastating, and said nothing about any of it to anyone ever. The last time they had actually spoken, really spoken, not the surface-level exchange of a girl telling a staff member what she needed, had been 8 months ago, in January, when the palazzo had been ice-quiet, and Sophia had found Marco in the library at 2 a.m. reading a book on corporate law that he had no official reason to possess. She had stood in the doorway in her nightgown and socks with her arms crossed, and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. "Nobody uses this library," Marco said without looking up. "I do," Sophia said. At 2 a.m, he raised his brow, catching her off guard. "I couldn't sleep," she responded, and leaned against the doorframe. The fireplace was burning low, casting everything in the color of old honey. "What are you reading?" she asked. Marco held up the spine, and Sophia squinted across the room, then looked at him with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. "That's not light reading." He shrugged, not bothering to look her way. "It is to me." Sophia's eyes blazed. "Marco," she said, crossing the room and sitting down on the arm of the chair across from him. Not in it, but perched on its arm, which was somehow more informal and more intimate than sitting properly would have been. "Why do you know corporate law?" He closed the book. Green eyes up. "Why do you?" he repeated back to her. She paused for a small moment before answering. "My father made me study business administration in Switzerland," she said. "I had a reason." "Well, so do I," he concurred. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the Calabrian night was absolute. No sound from the cliffs or wind, just the enormous southern silence that pressed against the palazzo's old walls and made the inside feel like a held breath. "Are you planning to leave?" she asked. The question came out quieter than she intended. Marco said nothing. "Marco," she probed. "Go back to bed, Sophia," he said in a grim voice. She stood, straightened her nightgown, and lifted her chin the very smallest degree. A tell of hers that he'd noticed a long time ago. It simply meant she was choosing not to say the thing she was actually thinking. She walked to the door, stopped without turning around. "I hope," she said, "that wherever you're planning to go, it's somewhere that deserves you." She left. Marco sat with the fire for another hour and didn't read another page. The preparations for Sophia's 20th birthday began 3 days out, and the palazzo transformed the way it always transformed for occasions. Methodically, expensively, and with the particular energy of a household that understands the difference between a celebration and a performance. Elena commanded the kitchen with the efficiency of a general whose army happened to be armed with wooden spoons. She had a clipboard, handwritten, organized in columns, and she moved through the kitchen assigning tasks with short, precise sentences that left no room for misinterpretation. The girls moved faster when Elena was running the floor. Not from fear. From something more like respect. The specific respect that arises when people can see that the person directing them is also doing twice as much as anyone else. By evening of the second day, the kitchen smelled of braised lamb, of candied citrus peel, and of pastry browning slowly in the ancient stone oven. Marco was on his fourth task of the hour, currently wrestling a folding table through the service corridor, when his mother appeared at the end of the hall. "Stop," she said. He stopped. Elena studied him for a moment. Then she crossed to him, reached up, and smoothed a section of his collar that had folded back on itself. Her hand lingered there for just a second, at his collar, at the side of his jaw. Not quite a touch. More like the ghost of one, the memory of the gesture more than the gesture itself. "You've been working since 5 a.m., she said. "Well, so have you," he answered with a small smile. A smile Marco only reserved for the woman who gave birth to him. "I'm the one who decides when I've worked too long." She lowered her hand. "Eat something. Sit down for 20 minutes. I need you sharp for tomorrow." "I'm fine. Marco." Her voice was even. "Don't perform endurance at me. I practically invented the performance myself." She held his gaze. "Eat. Sit. 20 minutes. He studied her face, the dark eyes, the gold bracelet catching the corridor light, the quality of her stillness that he had inherited and spent years learning to use in the way she used it. She was 43 and still, unmistakably, beautiful, in the way that a piece of architecture is beautiful. Not despite its age, but because of the precision with which it has weathered. "Is there anything left of the sfogliatelle?" he asked. Something moved in her eyes. Not quite a smile, but could easily pass for one. Francesca hid 3 in the back of the cooling rack. "Of course she did. She likes you. She likes feeding people. I happen to be convenient." Elena watched him go. She stood in the corridor for a moment after he turned the corner, and she did something she almost never did. She pressed one hand flat against the stone wall, and she breathed, just breathed, for 10 unscheduled seconds. Her left wrist rested against the stone. The bracelet was cool to the touch. Then she straightened her spine and walked back to her kitchen. The night of the birthday arrived with the Calabrian sky doing something operatic, clear, deep blue at the horizon grading up through violet into a darkness so absolute and star-heavy it looked painted. The candles in every window of the palazzo turned the estate into something from another century, which was, in a sense, the precise aesthetic the Don intended. Don Vittorio Calabrese threw parties the way he ran everything else, with the absolute conviction of a man who understood that power is not just held but performed, and that the performance, executed correctly, becomes indistinguishable from the reality. He stood in the main salon in a dark suit that had not come off a rack, silver-haired and thick-shouldered, conducting the social geometry of the room with the unhurried authority of a man who has not needed to raise his voice in 20 years. Associates came to him. He received them. Cheeks were kissed. Words were spoken in the half-sentenced dialect of the people at these tables, every phrase carrying a cargo of meaning that required fluency to unpack and years of exposure to earn. Sophia moved through it all in dark green silk, her chestnut hair arranged with one coil left deliberately loose at her neck, a heel traded for flats in exactly the way she always quietly refused the role while appearing to play it perfectly. She laughed at the right moments. She deflected the more intrusive questions with a precision that looked like warmth. She held her champagne glass with 2 fingers and a thumb and stood at the balcony railing at the edge of the terrace, looking out at the sea. Below, the cliff face dropped in stages to the dark water. The string quartet on the lower terrace played something from Puccini, something that floated up through the candle-warm air and seemed to belong to the stones. Sophia looked out at the horizon and tilted her chin up, just slightly, and didn't say the thing she was thinking, which was, "I am 20 years old, and I don't know what I want. And that terrifies me more than any of this." Marco was not supposed to be anywhere near the balcony. He was cutting through the south garden, the longer service route, the one that kept him entirely clear of the event, carrying a silver tray that Francesca had sent him back for, moving fast through the dark between the cypress trees. He heard it before he saw it. Not a sound, but the absence of one, the specific absence of sound that happens when someone who is supposed to blend and has gone still in a place where movement is expected. He came around the edge of the garden wall and had a direct sight line to the upper terrace. The waiter was standing at the back of the crowd, white jacket, dark trousers, completely correct for the evening. Except his feet were planted. Except his weight was distributed forward rather than neutral. Except his right hand was tucked against his side in the exact position of a man who is not holding a tray. Marco's eyes moved from the hand to the angle of the man's gaze. Sophia at the railing, her back to the room. Champagne glass catching the light. Laughing at God knows what. The shape beneath the white jacket resolved. Marco dropped the tray. The sound of it hitting the garden path, silver on stone, bright and sharp, was lost entirely in the noise of the party. No one on the terrace turned. The waiter's head moved a single degree, scanning. He found nothing in the dark garden, and so returned to Sophia's back. Marco was already running. He came up the garden steps without slowing, hit the terrace door with his shoulder, and had 3 meters of open space between him and the waiter when the man started to turn. He didn't stop for the turn and ran right at the waiter, tackling him off the ground. The tackle was exactly what you'd expect. It was ugly, violent, and incredibly lethal. Marco hit the man at the hip, drove forward, and they went over the stone railing together with the particular violence of 2 things that were not designed to stop. They were suspended in the air for a full 5 seconds before finally reaching the floor below. The courtyard stone suddenly came up without warning, and the sound of the impact was quite brutal. The waiter slammed into the ground in the worst way possible, his arm bent, and his neck snapped almost immediately. His pistol skidded free across the tiles, disappearing into the ground as Marco hit the ground on his left side, and felt something in his shoulder separate in a way that communicated itself as white light and then as a specific, nauseating wrongness. His head found the edge of a terracotta planter on the way down, a glancing blow, but enough. He lay still for 1 second. 1 second. Then he pushed himself up. He was bleeding from the brow. He could feel it more than see it, the warmth of it tracking down the left side of his face, the slight narrowing of his vision on that side. His left shoulder felt wrong. He filed both facts and stood anyway, because above him, at the broken railing, Sophia was standing. She was looking down at him. Whatever expression she was wearing, he hadn't seen it before. Not the social performance, not the dry wit, not the cultivated poise of the Don's daughter conducting herself in public. This was something underneath all of that. Something cracked open and raw, and entirely undefended. He looked up at her, and he did not sit back down. The waiter was not moving. Shouts were erupting now on the upper terrace. The party breaking apart, chairs scraping, the Don's voice cutting through the noise like a blade through cloth. Guards were already at the doors. Marco stood in the courtyard with his shoulder hanging the wrong way and blood moving slowly down his jaw, and he positioned himself between the door below and the woman above it, and he waited. He had no weapon. He had no authority. He had nothing except the fact of himself, standing still and completely certain in the candlelight, and the absolute refusal to do anything other than what he was doing. The guards came through the door 4 seconds later. They stopped when they saw him. Then they saw the waiter on the ground, the pistol 3 feet away on the tiles, Marco standing over it. The bigger of the 2 guards said something into his earpiece. From above, Sophia's voice came down, very quiet and very clear, with none of the performance in it. "Don't touch him." Marco did not look up. He kept his eyes on the door. He waited, and somewhere above him, in the window of the main salon, Don Vittorio Calabrese stood with his hands behind his back and looked down at the maid's son standing in his courtyard covered in blood. And for the first time in 20 years of sharing walls with the Ricci family, he actually looked at him. His face gave nothing away. It never did, but he looked for a very long time. The Calabrese estate at 6 o'clock in the morning was a different animal entirely from the one it became by noon. No suits. No ceremony. The kitchen breathed steam and the smell of strong coffee, and Elena Ricci moved through it the way she moved through everything, with complete authority and zero noise. Dark hair pulled back into a tight bun. Dark eyes that missed nothing and volunteered nothing. She had been running this kitchen for 20 years, and every surface of it knew her. She was scrubbing a copper pot she'd already scrubbed twice when her son walked in. She didn't turn around. Mothers who pay attention develop a particular sensitivity to their children's footsteps, the specific rhythm, the weight distribution, the small variations that mean something or mean nothing. The footstep she heard now definitely meant something. It was half a beat slower on the left than it should have been, and there was a quality to the breathing behind it that she had last heard when Marco was 11 and had cracked 2 ribs falling from the estate's eastern wall. She set the pot down and turned around. He had cleaned his face, which made it worse somehow. The split above his brow was a dark, precise line, and the bruising had arrived in full, mottled across his left cheekbone in colors that made her stomach perform a movement she didn't let reach her face. His shoulder was strapped under his shirt. He was wearing his good shirt because he hadn't had time to change before the guards came, and he hadn't been back to his room since. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and for just a moment, a single, private moment, he let her see it. All of it. The pain he hadn't let anyone else observe. The particular vulnerability that only existed inside these walls, inside her radius. Elena crossed the kitchen. She took his face in both hands, those capable, work-hardened hands, and she turned it gently to the light, and she looked at what had been done to him. Her thumbs moved carefully around the edges of the bruising, cataloging without pressing. She checked his shoulder with 3 precise touches. She had not been trained in medicine. She had simply spent 19 years learning the geography of this boy's body well enough to know when something was wrong with it. She didn't speak. Neither did he. When she was satisfied, or rather, when she had established the full inventory of damage and accepted it with the particular grace of a woman accustomed to absorbing terrible things quietly, she dropped her hands and turned back to the stove. She lifted the coffee pot. She poured him a cup and set it on the table and sat down across from the empty chair, and he sat in it. On Elena's left wrist, the thin gold bracelet caught the kitchen light. It always caught the light. It was the kind of detail you only noticed after seeing it 100 times, and then could never unnotice. Marco wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Outside, the estate was waking up, footsteps on marble above them, the distant sound of a telephone, the normal machinery of the household reassembling itself after a night that had been anything but. "The Don wants to see you," Elena said finally. Her voice was level, giving nothing away. "Isn't that a surprise?" Marco chuckled. "Stop it, Marco. This is serious." He let out a disgruntled sigh. "I know." She looked at her hands on the table. "Marco." A pause. The kind that meant the next sentence had been assembled carefully. "Whatever he offers you, think before you answer." He looked at her. "I always think." She met his eyes. "I know you do. And that's what I'm worried about." The study smelled of old wood and cigar smoke, and the particular variety of silence that accumulates in rooms where significant things have been decided for decades. Don Vittorio Calabrese sat behind his desk like the desk had been built around him. Big, silver-haired, still in the specific way of a man who has not needed to perform authority since his 40s. He was in his shirt sleeves, which on another man would have suggested informality. But on the Don, it suggested only that he had decided Marco did not require the full performance. He looked at Marco the way he looked at everything, with the total, unhurried attention of a man who had been reading people for 40 years and had never entirely decided he was finished learning. Marco sat across from him, bruised, strapped, upright. The Don's eyes moved across the damage on Marco's face with no visible reaction. He picked up the cigar, drew on it once, and set it back in the ashtray. "You work in the garden," he said. "Not a question. An establishing of facts." "Yes," Marco answered. "And what's this I hear about you helping your mother with the evening service?" The Don asked, taking another drag of his cigar. "Only when she needs it." Marco answered firmly. "You were working the east garden." He had already spoken to the guards. He had the geography of the night fully mapped. "You were not supposed to be near the south terrace." "No," Marco agreed. "And yet." The Don was quiet for a moment. The cigar sent a thin thread of smoke toward the ceiling. "The man you took off that balcony," the Don finally said, "was sent by the Ferrante family. Do you know the Ferrante family?" A pause that lasted exactly as long as honesty required. "I know the name," Marco finally said. The Don's eyes flashed with curiosity. Most people in this estate don't know the name. Then something shifted in the Don's expression. Not warmth, exactly. Something more evaluating than warmth. "Do you read, boy?" "Yes," Marco answered. "What do you read?" "Everything and anything available." The Don looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into the desk drawer and produced a single sheet of paper, which he did not look at. He already knew what was on it. He'd spent the previous evening making the inquiries he preferred to make before conversations like this one. "You saved my little princess, boy. So I'm going to offer you something," the Don said. "And you're going to tell me what you want. Anything within reason. Money. A position for your mother. References for work elsewhere. Good references. Work that suits her." He paused. "Anything you want, name it." The silence that followed was long enough that the Don raised one silver eyebrow. "I want to work for you," Marco said. "Not in the kitchen. Not in the garden. At the table." Outside, somewhere in the estate's upper floors, a door closed. The distant sound of ordinary life continuing, indifferent to the specific geometry of this room. The Don laughed. It came out genuine, a surprised, real sound, which was rare enough from him that it would have startled anyone who knew him. Then he looked at Marco's face, and the laugh dissolved. Because Marco had not flinched. He hadn't performed confidence, had not leaned forward with the hungry body language of ambition. He sat in the chair with a broken shoulder and a split face and green eyes that were entirely, disconcertingly steady, and he looked like a man who had already walked all the way to the end of this conversation in his head and found it perfectly satisfactory. The Don drew on his cigar. "You're 19 years old." "Yes. Your mother scrubs my floors. She manages your household," Marco said, with a quietness that was not quite a correction and not quite not one. "I'd say there's a particular distinction." The Don's eyes sharpened. He studied Marco for another long moment, the particular study of a man recalibrating. "Come back tomorrow," he said finally. "Same time." Marco stood. He buttoned his jacket with his good hand. The left one was significantly less useful than usual, and he gave a short, respectful nod that managed to contain neither subservience nor arrogance, which was its own kind of remarkable achievement, and he left. The Don sat for a moment in the silence after the door closed. Then he picked up the telephone on his desk. "Find out everything," he said to whoever answered. "The boy. All of it. Tonight." What the Don's inquiries produced, over the course of that evening, was not what he had expected. Marco Ricci had taught himself 3 languages from books discarded by estate guests. His Italian was native, his English was excellent, and his French, the Don's contact reported with audible puzzlement, was better than most people educated in it from birth. He had spent years, patient, invisible years, learning the patterns of the Calabrese business from the vantage point of someone everyone assumed wasn't paying attention. He had once, at 16, identified an accounting discrepancy in the estate's supply invoices that the Don's own administrator had missed for 8 months, and had left a single corrected line item in the invoice folder without signature or explanation. The Don's administrator had assumed it was a clerical error corrected by someone in his own office. He had never investigated further. He had no idea it was the garden boy. The Don read the last of his contact's findings and sat for a long moment looking at the wall. He had sat across from ambitious men his entire life. He knew the texture of ambition, the specific heat of it, the way it made people talk slightly too fast and listen slightly too little. What he had seen in Marco Ricci's face that morning was not the texture of ambition. It was something rarer and considerably more interesting. Patience. The cold, total, absolute patience of a young man who had been waiting for a very specific moment for a very long time and had never once moved before it arrived. The Don picked up the cigar. Outside his window, the Calabrian coast was a dark mass against a darker sea. The lights of the estate reflected faintly in the water below the cliffs. He thought about the accounting correction, left without signature, without expectation of credit. He thought about Marco standing in the courtyard with no weapon and a dislocated shoulder, putting himself between his daughter and a door. He made his decision sometime around midnight, poured himself a measure of whiskey he didn't finish, and went to bed. In the kitchen below, long after the rest of the estate had gone quiet, Elena Ricci sat alone at the table where she'd drunk coffee with her son that morning. The kitchen was immaculate, but to be fair, it was always immaculate when she was done with it. The copper pots reflected the low light. The marble surfaces were clear and cold. She turned the gold bracelet on her wrist, around and around, a habit so old she was no longer conscious of it except in moments like this one, when the silence got large enough that everything small became visible. She had worn it since she was 17. It had been her mother's. Before that it had belonged to a woman whose name Elena had memorized as a child and recited like a rosary, the full line of women in her family, going back further than anyone had bothered to record carefully. The bracelet had survived everything that had not survived. It was the only object she owned that connected her to the version of her life that existed before a man named Silvio Greco sat down across from her father with forged documents and a reasonable expression and dismantled everything with the efficient tidiness of someone who had done it before and would do it again. She heard, in the silence, the particular echo of tomorrow's conversation. her son in that leather chair. The Don's eyes doing what they always did, calculating, measuring, deciding. She pressed her thumb against the bracelet's clasp and held it. Not yet, she thought, to no one in particular. To the kitchen, maybe. To the walls that had absorbed 20 years of her silence. But soon. She didn't know what she meant by soon. She suspected Marco did. She got up, turned off the light, and climbed the back stairs to her room, moving through the dark with the ease of a woman who had learned every step of this house, so well she no longer needed to see it. In the estate's east wing, 3 floors above, Sophia Calabrese stood at her bedroom window and looked out at the courtyard below. The stone where the man had landed was clean. Someone had dealt with it efficiently. The way everything in this house that needed disappearing was disappeared. She pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass. The look on Marco's face when he stood up. The extraordinary, unreasonable, completely unnecessary steadiness of it. She had known him since she was 5 years old, and he was 4, the summer she'd discovered the kitchen stairs, and the maid's son who read with a flashlight under the prep table when everyone else was asleep. She had spent 15 years carefully not thinking about what that look on his face just did to something in her chest. She stepped back from the window. She was the Don's daughter. She had been educated in 4 countries and trained in the art of reasonable decisions. She went to bed and lay in the dark and was extremely reasonable for approximately 5 minutes. Then she gave up, stared at the ceiling, and thought about a particular set of green eyes until dawn. The Don said yes to Marco at 9 o'clock the following morning with the same energy another man might use to pass the salt. No ceremony. No conditions outlined at length. He looked up from the papers on his desk when Marco entered and said, "You'll sit in on Thursday's meeting. You'll speak when I ask you to speak and not before. We'll see," and looked back down. That was it. That was the whole thing. Marco said, "Thank you," and left before the Don could reconsider, which was the smartest thing he did that entire week. Thursday's meeting was held in the estate's formal dining room with 8 men around the table, none of whom had been told in advance that the maid's son would be occupying the chair at the Don's left. The reaction moved around the room in a wave, a tightening here, a carefully neutral expression there. One man, heavy-set and gray-bearded, who made no effort to conceal that he found the arrangement offensive. This was Luca Mancini, the Don's consigliere of 14 years, a man who believed deeply in the established order of things and considered its disruption a personal inconvenience. He looked at Marco the way a man looks at a chair that has been placed in the wrong position. Not angry, exactly. Just wrong. Requiring correction. Marco sat down, folded his hands on the table, and gave Luca Mancini the most respectful, most completely empty smile he had ever assembled. The meeting was about territory. Specifically, the encroachment of the Ferrante family, the same family that had sent the man off the balcony, into 2 shipping routes the Calabrese had used without contest for a decade. The Don's men argued. They used the particular language of men who conduct violent business in the vocabulary of logistics, which Marco had been studying from a distance for 5 years and could now follow without effort. He said nothing for 2 hours and 14 minutes. Then one of the men, younger, aggressive, the type who confused loudness with leverage, proposed a response that would have guaranteed escalation and almost certainly a war the Calabrese would win at a cost that made winning indistinguishable from losing. The room began to coalesce around the proposal. The Don said nothing. His eyes moved once to Marco. "The Ferrante's eastern route depends on a single port administrator," Marco said. And the room went quiet in the startled way of rooms that have forgotten there's an extra person in them. "His name is Benedetto Sartori. He's been taking money from the Ferrante family for 4 years. He was taking money from the Messina family before that. He takes money from whoever pays him, which means he can be paid by someone else." A pause. "That's cheaper than a war. And it leaves the Ferrante family with a logistics problem that looks, from the outside, like their own incompetence." The silence lasted long enough to become a specific kind of silence. Luca Mancini then said, "Who asked you?" "The Don," Marco said simply. At 9 o'clock Tuesday morning. The Don drew on his cigar. Said nothing. But the meeting, when it concluded 40 minutes later, moved in the direction of port administrators rather than open conflict, and Luca Mancini left the room with the careful expression of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already finished calculating. The first time Sophia engineered a reason to be in the same room as Marco after the balcony, she did it so smoothly that she almost convinced herself it was accidental. She came down to the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon. Not unusual, she occasionally visited her mother's kitchen staff, and found Marco at the table with 3 open books and a cup of coffee that had gone cold a while ago. He was cross-referencing something between the books with the focused intensity of a man who had temporarily forgotten the physical world existed. He looked up when she entered, and something moved through his expression, quickly, efficiently contained. "Signorina Calabrese," he said, and started to stand. "Sit down, Marco." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat without being invited, which was a habit that drove her father's associates insane and had never once bothered her. She looked at the books. Property law, tax records, and a third volume she didn't immediately recognize, some kind of historical registry. "What are you looking for?" she asked. A pause. One beat too long to be comfortable. "Background research," he said finally. "Your father asked me to understand the estate's holdings." It was a plausible answer. It was also, Sophia observed with the instincts of someone raised in a house where nothing was ever entirely what it appeared to be, approximately half of the truth. She reached out and turned the registry toward her before he could stop her without making it obvious he wanted to stop her. She looked at the open page. A list of property transfers. Dated 21 years ago. A name highlighted in penciled brackets, so light you'd miss it if you weren't looking. Ricci. She turned the book back. She looked at Marco. His face had gone very still in the way that she was already, against all reasonable intentions, learning to read. "Your mother's family?" she asked quietly. The stillness stretched for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. She didn't ask anything else. She looked at the cold coffee, stood up, went to the stove, and came back with a fresh cup, which she set in front of him without comment. Then she sat back down and picked up the property law volume, and she said, "What am I looking for?" in the same tone she might have used to ask about the weather. Marco looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something between wariness and something that was working very hard not to be relief. "The transfer on page 43, he said. "Tell me if the guarantor's signature matches the seal on the document behind it." She turned to page 43. She looked at the signature. She looked at the seal on the document tucked behind it. She was meticulous about it, checking 3 times before she looked up. "They don't match," she said. "The signature is Greco's, but the seal belongs to my father's office." The quality of Marco's stillness changed. She felt it more than saw it, a shift in the room's atmosphere, subtle as a change in air pressure before rain. "Your father's seal," he said carefully. "Or your father?" She understood the distinction immediately. The office seal. Anyone with access to the study could have used it. She set the book down. She looked directly at him. "Marco, what did Greco do?" He told her. Not everything, not yet, but enough. His voice was level and quiet and completely without performance, which made it worse somehow, made every fact land with the weight of something long carried rather than freshly discovered. He told her about his mother's family, the land, the forged transfer, the manufactured debt. He told her that Silvio Greco, who ate Sunday dinner 20 feet from Elena Ricci and said thank you, dear when she refilled his glass, had constructed her poverty with the careful precision of a man who considered it a business transaction and had never revisited it since. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Sophia's honey-brown eyes had gone through several different temperatures during the telling. By the end they had settled on something cool and completely resolved. "How long have you known?" she said. 2 years of certainty. Before that, suspicion. And you came here, to this table, to work for my father. Because of Greco. Partly. What's the other part? He looked at her steadily. Access to the archives. Which you've been denied, she asked with a brow. Marco shook his head. Which I've been given partial access to. There are older records I need. Pre-organization, before your father formalized the filing system. They're in the lower archive. I just haven't found a reason to request them that wouldn't draw attention. Sophia was quiet for a moment. She turned the bracelet detail over in her mind. Not the bracelet itself, but something Marco had said in passing. She never takes it off. The way he'd said it. Like a man who had spent years watching his mother hold onto the one thing nobody had managed to take from her. I've been in the lower archive, Sophia said. My father keeps family records there. Historical documents. I've gone down twice for research. She paused. He's never questioned it. Marco looked at her with the specific expression of a man who is performing not understanding something while understanding it completely. I'm not asking you to do that, he said. I know you're not. She stood up, smoothed her dress, deep green silk today, ivory trim at the collar, the single defiant detail being a pair of flat shoes that her father's guests always clocked with faint disapproval. I'm telling you I'm going to. There's a difference. She picked up her things. At the kitchen door she paused, turned back. Thursday, she said. My father has dinner with the Morelli brothers. He'll be gone until midnight. I'll go down at 8. She left. Marco sat for a moment looking at the door she'd walked through. Then he picked up the cold coffee, the new cup she'd made, and drank it, and there was something in his face in that unobserved moment that he would have erased immediately if he'd known anyone was watching. He wasn't in love with her. He had made that decision at 14 with the careful pragmatism of a boy who understood that certain feelings were a luxury that his particular life could not sustain. He had maintained that decision for 5 years with considerable discipline. But all of a sudden, the discipline was getting expensive. Downstairs, 1 floor below the kitchen, in the corridor that connected the wine cellar to the estate's oldest storage rooms, was a door that required a key Elena Ricci had carried for 15 years. Not because anyone had given it to her deliberately. It had simply migrated into her possession the way things migrated in households run by women of her particular efficiency, finding its way to the person most likely to care for what it protected. She had never opened the archive door herself. She had never been tempted. She kept the key because the key needed keeping, and because she was, underneath everything, a woman of tremendous discipline. On Thursday morning she stood in that corridor with a basket of cleaning supplies and looked at the door for a long time. Then she looked at the key in her hand. Then she put the key in her apron pocket, picked up the basket, and turned back toward the wine cellar. She had almost reached the stairs when she heard footsteps coming down them. She recognized them without looking up. 20 years in a house teaches you its people's rhythms. Silvio Greco's car arrives at 6, she said, before he rounded the corner. I need someone to open the east gate. The footsteps stopped. I'll tell the guard, said a young voice, one of the junior household staff. Tell him before 5:30. Not after. Yes, Signora Ricci. The footsteps retreated back up the stairs. Elena stood in the corridor with her basket, perfectly still, and something moved through her face. A sequence of expressions that crossed and dissolved too quickly to name individually, leaving behind only the familiar, composed surface that 20 years had perfected. Greco arrived at 6. She heard his car on the gravel above. She heard his voice in the foyer. That warm, performative voice, the one that made people feel he was genuinely pleased to see them, because he probably was, and because Silvio Greco moved through the world in the comfortable certainty that the world was arranged for his pleasure and convenience, and had no particular evidence to suggest otherwise. She set a table she had set 500 times. She heard him laugh at something the Don said. She heard his footsteps cross the marble foyer and stop. Elena, the voice from the doorway of the dining room. She was straightening silverware. She turned. He was standing in the doorway in a light gray suit that had cost more than 3 months of her salary, tan and trim, the attractive unreality of a man for whom everything had always been managed. He smiled at her, genuinely warmly, with absolutely nothing behind it. The room looks beautiful, as always. Thank you, Signor Greco, she said, in the voice she had been using with him for 20 years. Even. Professional. Revealing absolutely nothing. He nodded, that slight condescension, not even conscious, just the natural frequency of a man who considered the transaction complete, and went to join the Don. Elena turned back to the silverware. Her hands on the table were completely steady. She aligned a fork a millimeter to the left and held it there. Somewhere in the kitchen above her, her son was eating alone and thinking about documents she had spent 20 years pretending not to know existed. She let go of the fork. Thursday at 8 o'clock, Sophia came down the back stairs in dark trousers and a simple blouse. No silk tonight, nothing that rustled, carrying a small torch and moving with the purposeful quiet of a woman who had grown up in a house full of men who underestimated her and had found, over years, that this was its own extraordinary resource. Marco was already in the corridor. He had the estate's layout memorized. Of course he did. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was a charged, brief moment of 2 people who are about to do something that cannot be undone standing on the near side of it. The filing system is chronological on the left wall, she said quietly. My father reorganized everything after 2009. What we need will be pre-2009. Right wall, Marco said, asking for confirmation. Right wall. She repeated in agreement and unlocked the door with a key she'd taken from Elena's corridor hook an hour ago and replaced with a duplicate she'd had cut 3 days prior. Because Sophia Calabrese, when she decided to do something, did it with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that the details were where everything survived or collapsed. The archive was cold and smelled of old paper and stone. They went in. Marco found the relevant file in 11 minutes. He'd known approximately where it would be. The research of 2 years pointed here, to this box, to this specific series of documents. He opened it on the narrow table against the wall, angled the torch, and looked at what he'd spent 2 years working toward. The Don's seal. Used without authorization on a property transfer dated 21 years ago, guaranteeing the legitimacy of a transaction that was fraud from the first signature. Silvio Greco's name on every document. And below it, in a transfer of custodial funds, a second name. A bank. A series of account numbers. The money trail. Complete and intact. 21 years old and perfectly preserved in the cold dark of a room nobody had looked in since. Marco went very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. This was not calculation. This was something older and quieter and significantly more dangerous, and Sophia, standing at his shoulder reading the same documents, felt it come off him like a change in temperature. She didn't speak. She let him have the moment. She understood, intuitively and completely, that some things need to be felt before they can be acted on, and that the right response to witnessing that process in someone new. She stopped that thought. Firmly. Professionally. She looked at the documents. "This is enough," she said quietly. "This is everything." "Almost," Marco said. His voice had changed slightly. Still quiet, still controlled, but with something underneath it now. Something that had been patient for a very long time and was beginning, just beginning, to understand that its patience was nearly finished. "I need one more thing. The land registry amendment. The one that finalized the transfer." "Where?" "Your father's desk. The locked drawer on the left side. There's a secondary archive file, blue cover, no label." Sophia was quiet for a moment. She turned and looked at him directly. "You've been in my father's study." "I've been near it," Marco said carefully. "I haven't touched that drawer." "But you know about it," she probed. "I know about most things in this house," he shrugged. She held his gaze for a moment with those honey-brown eyes that were not, at this proximity, in this specific low light, remotely as soft as they appeared from a distance. "Give me 3 days," she said. He nodded. She relocked the archive door. They went back up the stairs separately, 5 minutes apart, moving through the dark house with the practiced invisibility of two people who had both, in very different ways, spent their entire lives learning how not to be seen when it mattered. Neither of them acknowledged, going up those stairs, how close they'd been standing in the archive, how natural it had felt, how neither of them had moved away. Some things are understood perfectly without being said. That understanding, unspoken, unreferenced, followed them both to their separate rooms and kept them awake considerably longer than they would have admitted to anyone. Somewhere else in the estate, in his silver-walled guest room with his expensive luggage perfectly arranged, Silvio Greco was sleeping the deep, untroubled sleep of a man with an entirely clean conscience. Down the hall, behind a door she had scrubbed and polished and cared for without ever entering, a file box sat in the cold dark with 21 years of evidence inside it, patient as stone, waiting for the morning Marco Ricci decided to deliver it.
If this story is doing something to you, and it should be, hit that like button right now, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment below. Would Sophia risk everything for Marco? Tell me what you think. The grand finale is coming, and nothing will be the same after it.
3 days passed. Sophia said nothing. Marco said nothing. They moved through the estate in their separate orbits. Him at the table for Tuesday's meeting, her at dinner with her father and 2 visiting associates from Palermo, and the only evidence that anything had shifted between them was the quality of the space when they occupied the same room. A new kind of awareness. The sort that had no name and requires none. On the morning of the 3rd day, Sophia came down to breakfast, kissed her father's cheek, poured herself coffee, and said, "Papa, I need to access the study this afternoon. I'm finishing the history of the Calabrese land holdings for the centenary record. You mentioned the original registry documents were in your desk." The Don looked at her over his newspaper. That unreadable face. Those eyes that never committed to a temperature. "The locked drawer," he said. "If that's where they are." A pause that lasted long enough for Sophia to take a calm sip of coffee she did not taste. "After 3, the Don said, and returned to his newspaper. Sophia set her cup down. "Thank you, Papa." She did not look toward the corridor where Marco had appeared briefly at the edge of her peripheral vision, nor did he look at her. But she felt, across the distance of the hallway, the particular quality of his stillness, and it felt, if she was being honest with herself in the way she increasingly was, like a hand briefly pressed to glass. She found it exactly where Marco said it would be. Blue cover, no label, tucked behind 2 years of land administration records at the back of the locked drawer. She photographed every page with the small camera she'd purchased in the village 3 weeks ago, before the archive, before any of this was confirmed, because Sophia Calabrese had her father's instincts even when she wished she didn't, and replaced everything with the precision of a woman who understood that the devil lived entirely in small details. She relocked the drawer. She sat for a moment in her father's chair, the same leather chair where Marco had sat opposite the Don and asked for a seat at the table. The room smelled of cigar smoke and wood polish, and the specific gravity of accumulated authority. She thought about what she'd just done, not with regret, with clarity, the kind that arrives after a decision has been made and the body catches up to what the mind already knew. Then she stood, smoothed her dress, and went to find Marco. He was in the east garden, just standing at the low stone wall that looked out over the cliff edge and the sea below, his jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled. The bruising on his face faded now to something greenish-yellow at the edges. He heard her coming and turned before she spoke, which she had stopped finding surprising. She handed him the photographs without ceremony. He took them, looked through each one, and she watched his face do the thing it did when he was absorbing something significant, the complete, concentrated stillness, and then a single slow exhale that released whatever the stillness had been containing. "What about the amendment?" he said. Sophia paused for a small moment. "The witness is a notary who died in 2014, which means he can't be questioned, which means Greco chose him deliberately." She folded her arms. "He planned for the long term. He always did." Marco looked at the last photograph for a long moment. Then he squared the photographs together, looked up, and met her eyes. "Sophia." It was the first time, as adults, that he had used her name without the formality. It arrived in the air between them with the weight of something that had been held back for a very long time, and neither of them pretended not to notice. "Don't thank me," she said before he could. "I didn't do it for gratitude." "I know why you did it," he countered almost immediately. Sophia scoffed softly. "Is that so?" A long pause. The sea moved far below them. Somewhere in the estate behind them, voices, staff, guards, the ordinary machinery of the house. Out here it was just the wind and the space between two people standing close enough that the space itself felt like something. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." She held his gaze for exactly long enough to make the point, then looked out at the sea. "When are you going to tell my father?" she ended up asking. "When I have the full assembly. The documents, the bank records, the original transfer. Everything cross-referenced. He needs to see the complete picture, not pieces of it." Marco paused. "He needs to understand that Greco used his seal, that he was made complicit without his knowledge. If I present it wrong, the Don's first reaction will be about his own exposure, and Greco will survive the distraction." Sophia turned to look at him. "You've thought about this for a long time." 2 years, he admitted. "Even about my father's psychology." Marco's jaw clenched just a bit. "I've thought about every variable," he answered. She was quiet for a moment. Then softly, "Every variable except one." He looked at her, only to find out that she was already looking at him. "Me," she said simply. Not a challenge, not a confession, just a fact, placed on the table between them with the clean precision of a woman who had decided that being honest was worth the cost. Marco said nothing for a long moment. The wind moved through the garden. His green eyes did not look away from hers. "Not every variable," he said finally, very quietly. "I thought about you." It was not a declaration. It was something more than that, an admission that had been held for years, said plainly without decoration, which somehow made it heavier and more real than anything dressed in poetry would have been. Sophia felt it land somewhere in the middle of her chest and settle there. She nodded once. The chin lifted slightly, the tell she didn't know she had. Then she turned back toward the estate. "Tell me when you're ready to give it to him," she said. "I want to be there." She walked back toward the house. Marco watched her go. Then he turned back to the sea and stood there for a while with the photographs in his hand and something in his expression that he would never have permitted anyone to see, which was why he was alone when he let himself feel it. The assembly took 4 more days. Marco built it the way he built everything, methodically, without rushing, without a single unnecessary element. By the time he was finished, the file on his desk was the most complete forensic dismantling of Silvio Greco's life that had ever existed, and it had been assembled by a 19-year-old from a family with no resources, no connections, and no margin for error. He requested the meeting with the Don on a Tuesday morning. Private. He said it was about a security matter, which was both technically true and strategically phrased, because security matters went to the top of the Don's agenda without question. He told Sophia at 8 that morning in the kitchen. She was there when he came down, already dressed, coffee in both hands. She'd known it would be today. She handed him a cup without speaking. Elena was at the stove. She heard the quality of the silence between them and turned slowly, looking at her son's face with the precise attention of a woman who had been reading him since before he could speak. Marco looked at his mother. He had not told her the meeting was today. He had not, in 2 years of quiet investigation, told her the full scope of what he was doing, because Elena Ricci had spent 20 years building a peace with the life she had, and he had not wanted to shatter it before he had something to replace it with. He looked at her now, standing in her kitchen with her dark hair and her straight spine and the gold bracelet on her wrist, and he said simply, "Today." Elena set down the spatula. The color in her face did not change. Her hands did not tremble. She looked at her son for a long, full moment, taking inventory, the way she always did, cataloging something she needed to be sure of. Then she untied her apron, folded it, set it on the counter. "Then I'm coming," she said. "Mother, please don't make this a big deal." "I'm coming, Marco." He looked at her. She looked back with the absolute, immovable certainty of a woman who had waited 20 years for a specific morning and was not, under any circumstances, going to wait in a kitchen while it happened. "All right," he said. "I guess you're coming." Sophia set her coffee down, looked between them, and said nothing. Some moments do not need commentary. She understood this one. The Don looked up when the 3 of them entered the study. His expression registered the composition of the group. Marco, Sophia, and Elena Ricci in a pressed dark dress with her hands folded in front of her, and something shifted, briefly, in the unreadable face. Not surprise. The Don was rarely surprised, but a recalibration, a sharpening. "Sit," he said. Elena sat. This was, Marco understood, an act of extraordinary precision. Elena Ricci sitting in a chair in this study, in this house where she had served for 2 decades, as though she had always had the right to, which she had, and the room had never acknowledged. Marco opened the file. He did not perform what came next. He simply put the documents on the desk, one by one, and explained each one in the same quiet voice he used for everything, and let the evidence speak in the plain, devastating language of dated documents and forged signatures, and a seal that belonged to the Calabrese family and had been used without their knowledge or consent. The Don did not speak for the first 6 minutes. He read. He turned pages. His cigar went cold in the ashtray. At minute 7 he looked up, and his eyes moved to Elena. She met his gaze. 20 years of service were in that look, and beneath them, visible now, permitted to be visible for perhaps the first time, the full weight of what had been taken from her. The land, the name, the years, all of it, in one look, offered to the room without apology or performance. The Don looked back down at the documents. "Greco used my seal," he said. His voice was the quiet that came before something irreversible. "Without your knowledge," Marco said. "The evidence is clear on that. You were made an instrument, not a participant." A long silence. "He has eaten at my table," the Don said, "for 20 years. Nobody answered. The statement didn't require an answer. It required exactly what it received. The room's full, still attention, while the Don sat with it and let it become what it was. Then he looked at Sophia. Something passed across his face, brief, specific, the look of a man reading a situation he thought he understood and finding new information in it. His daughter had brought this to him. His daughter had put herself in this room, on this side of the table, next to the maid's son, and the quality of how she sat beside him was not lost on a man who had spent 40 years reading rooms. He looked at Marco last. For a long time. "How long?" he said. 2 years of evidence. A lifetime of suspicion. So that's why you wanted a seat at my table. You only came here for this." Yes, I came here for this, Marco confirmed. But I stayed because I found something worth staying for. The Don's eyes did not move to Sophia. They did not need to. Bring him to me, the Don said quietly. Tonight. Greco arrived at the estate at 7, summoned with a message that mentioned a new investment opportunity and used the specific language the Don had always used when he wanted Greco's full and prompt attention. He came in his light gray suit, unhurried, polished, carrying his customary bottle of wine for the Don's cellar. He was shown to the study. The room was not what he expected. The Don behind the desk. Marco in the chair to the right. Elena Ricci standing by the window. Greco's eyes moved across the room in a single sweep, and he almost contained the reaction. A fractional pause in the forward movement. A recalibration so fast it was nearly invisible. Nearly. Marco saw it. He had been watching Greco for 2 years with the attention of a man who needed to understand his adversary completely, and that fractional pause told him everything he needed to know about how much of the self-deception was genuine and how much was a performance. Both, he concluded, layered in ways that had probably become inseparable even to Greco himself. Vittorio, Greco said warmly, addressing the Don, his smile deploying like a reflex. I wasn't expecting a full room. Sit down, Silvio, the Don said. The specific tone of it, not unfriendly, not hostile, but simply absolute, landed in the room and removed all the available air. Greco sat. The Don put the file on the desk and slid it across. Read it, he said. Greco looked at the file. He opened it. He read with the particular attention of a man who already knows what he's about to see but cannot afford to show it, and the quality of his performance over the next 3 minutes was, Marco observed, extraordinary, genuinely extraordinary. He had been managing this for 20 years. He was very, very good at it. I don't understand, Greco said finally. The voice perfectly calibrated. Confusion with an edge of concern. These documents were compiled over 2 years, the Don said. Cross-referenced against the original records. The seal is mine. The authorization is not. He paused. And the land was hers. He did not gesture toward Elena. He did not need to. Something happened in Greco's face. The performance had been immaculate, but the Don had named it directly, without any preamble, without the conversational runway that allowed a man of Greco's skills to maneuver, and the directness hit something real beneath the surface. A flicker, gone in an instant. But the Don saw it, and Marco saw it, and Elena, standing at the window with 20 years of collected silence, saw it. Vittorio, Greco said, with the measured, reasonable tone of a man who genuinely believed his own framework. Whatever these documents suggest, I can assure you that the circumstances at the time were. Were what? The Don's voice hadn't changed. Still quiet. Still absolute. Complicated? Necessary? Business. Greco stopped. You used my name, the Don said. My seal. My table. And you sat at that table for 20 years, and you watched her serve it. The room was absolutely still. Elena turned from the window. She walked to the desk, slowly, with the upright, unhurried walk of a woman who had made a decision about how she was going to cross this particular room. She stopped at the edge of the desk. She looked at Silvio Greco, really looked at him, with 20 years of accumulated seeing, and she said nothing at all. She didn't need to. Her standing there, in this room, on this side of the desk, was the verdict and the sentence and the complete, total dismantling of the story he'd told himself about what he was. She was not furniture. She had never been furniture. She was Elena Ricci, and her family had owned land and a name before he decided it was inconvenient, and she was standing in front of him in the full knowledge of every single thing he had taken, and she was not broken. That was what broke him. Greco looked away first. For the first time in 40 years of managed surfaces and convenient frameworks, Silvio Greco looked away first. His hands on his knees were very still, and the stillness was not composed. It was the stillness of a man who has run out of the story he was telling. Nobody saw it coming. Not even Elena. 1 second she was standing there, silent, looking up at him. The next her right hand had crossed the distance between them and connected with the side of Silvio Greco's face with a sound that didn't belong in a room like this. Flat and hard and ugly. The kind of sound that reminds everyone present that underneath all the suits and the sealed documents and the careful language, bodies are still just bodies. Greco grabbed the arm of the chair. His cheek had gone red immediately, a hot flush spreading from jaw to temple. He stared at her. Elena stared back. Her chest was moving. Then something came loose in her, something she had packed down so deep for so long that it came up rough, and in the dialect her mother spoke, the dialect of the village she grew up in before any of this, before him. Vaffanculo. She spat the word. Then the next ones came faster, crowding each other. She spoke in fluent Italian, which loosely translated to, 20 years. 20 years I watched you sit at that table. In my house, on that land that was mine, that was my mother's before you signed my life away like a line item in a ledger. She stepped closer. Greco leaned back slightly in the chair, and Elena saw it, and something in her eyes said she'd been waiting 20 years to make a man like him lean back. Mio figlio. My son. Her voice broke on it, not in grief, but in fury, which is a different kind of breaking entirely. My son scrubbed floors that belonged to him, slept in a servant's room under a roof that was rightfully his. And you said good evening to me every time I poured your wine. She leaned down and spat on the floor in front of his feet. Not performed, not symbolic, just real, the realest thing that had happened in this room in 20 years. Then she straightened up, looked Silvio Greco dead in the face, and said it quietly, the way you say something when you've finally stopped needing the other person to understand it. Now you know how it feels. She turned around and walked out. No pause at the door. No final look. She'd already given him more of her eyes than he deserved. The door opened, she went through it, and it closed behind her. Not a slam, not a statement, just the ordinary sound of a door closing, which somehow made it worse. After a few seconds of cold, uncomfortable silence, the Don finally spoke. What happens now, the Don said, is not your concern. What happened to Greco was handled in the language the Calabrese family used for betrayals from within their circle, quietly, completely, and without the kind of disorder that attracted attention. The estate he had built on Elena's inheritance was transferred back, through channels the Don controlled, within 6 weeks. The legal architecture was complex but not impossible for a man of the Don's reach. The financial restitution was substantial. Greco's standing in every room that mattered evaporated in the specific, efficient way of a man who discovers that all his social capital had been borrowed against a relationship now permanently closed. He did not eat Sunday dinner at the Calabrese estate again. He did not eat anywhere significant again. He spent the rest of his comfortable, diminished years being very reasonable in smaller and smaller rooms, which was perhaps the most fitting conclusion available. Elena received the documents of restitution on a Monday morning. She read them at the kitchen table, alone, with the kitchen empty and the coffee going cold beside her. When she finished, she put them on the table and looked at the gold bracelet on her wrist for a long time. Then she looked up at the ceiling, at the marble floors above her, the estate above her, the whole accumulated weight of 20 years, and she exhaled. A long, slow, complete exhale that seemed to release something she had been carrying in her body, so long she'd stopped knowing it was there. She put the bracelet to her lips. She put the documents in her pocket. And then she stood up, straightened her spine, and went to start the day, but differently, on entirely different terms. As a woman who had chosen to be here, this morning, in this kitchen, which was the only difference in the world, and also the only one that had ever mattered. The courtship of Sophia Calabrese by Marco Ricci was conducted, in the Don's deliberate and watchful presence, with the slow burn of two people who had already been through something real and were in no hurry to diminish it with shortcuts. It was built in increments, a conversation that ran past midnight, a walk along the cliff path where their hands brushed and neither moved away, an evening in the library where Sophia read aloud from a novel she loved and Marco watched her face more than the book, and she knew it and kept reading anyway. It was the accumulation of 100 small chosen moments, each one a decision, and decisions made consistently over time have a name. The Don had the conversation with Marco in the study, one evening, 2 years after the Greco matter was closed. The door shut, the cigar going, the particular silence of a man who has been thinking about something for a while and has decided it is time. They talked about the estate, about legacy, about what a man builds and what he passes on and what he needs from the person who will stand beside his daughter when he is no longer capable of standing beside her himself. They talked about this for a long time, in the careful, indirect language of men who understand that the most significant things are sometimes said most honestly around the edges of other things. At the end, the Don looked at Marco for a long time. Then he picked up the cigar, drew on it once, and said, "She'll argue with you every day for the rest of your life." "I know," Marco said, "and you're prepared for that. I'm counting on it." The Don set the cigar down. The corner of his mouth moved, brief, contained. The version of warmth that appeared without warning and disappeared just as fast, so that you were never quite sure you'd seen it. Good, he said, and picked up his papers. The wedding was on a Saturday in September, when the Calabrian coast was amber and gold, and the sea was the color of something that had no adequate name in any of Marco's 3 languages. The estate had been dressed in white and deep green, and the guests were the kind of guests who attended Calabrese events, significant, watchful, impeccably behaved, and aware that what they were witnessing was not merely a marriage, but a particular kind of statement about what this family had become. Elena sat in the front row in silk she had chosen herself. Ivory, the color of the life she had decided at 43, was still entirely available to her. The gold bracelet was on her wrist. It would always be on her wrist. But today, for the first time, when someone asked her about it at the reception, one of the Don's older associates, a man with kind eyes and a curious nature, she told him. She told him about her mother and her mother's mother, and the line of women going back further than anyone had carefully recorded, and the land that had been hers, and what had happened to it, and what had come back. The man listened with the full attention of someone who understood that this was not a casual conversation. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he raised his glass to her. Not a toast, just a recognition, an acknowledgement of the thing she had carried and the way she had carried it. Elena raised hers back. Across the reception floor, Marco danced the first dance with his wife. Sophia in a dress that was silk and white and had one deliberate, defiant detail, a thin ribbon of deep green at the hem, her choice. She moved against him with the ease of 2 people who have been in each other's orbit long enough that the body simply knows. She said something quietly into his shoulder. He laughed, the real laugh, the rare one, the one almost no one ever produced. She felt it and smiled into the fabric of his jacket. Then he guided her gently toward the edge of the floor. 1 minute, he said quietly. She followed his eyes to the front row, where Elena had just finished telling her story and was accepting a glass raised in her direction with the particular composure of a woman who has finally earned the right to receive things gracefully. Go, Sophia said. She touched his hand briefly and stepped back. Marco crossed the floor to his mother. He held out his hand. She looked at it, then at his face, that inventory she'd always taken, cataloging him out of love and 20 years of vigilance. And for a moment her expression did the thing it almost never did. It let everything through. She took his hand. They danced, the maid's son and the woman who had scrubbed marble floors and read to him by flashlight and pushed him hard when softness would have been easier and never, for a single day of his life, let him believe that small was the same as permanent. The Don watched from his chair in the corner of the room, a glass in one hand, the unreadable face doing something it almost never did in company. Something that was close to almost being called moved. Then he raised the glass to his lips, and it was gone, filed away, returned to wherever the Don kept the things that were too significant for the surface. Nobody who saw it mentioned it, but they all remembered it.
If this story got you, if Elena's bracelet, Marco's patience, or Sophia's choice did something to you, then you know what to do. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me your favorite moment and where you're watching from. Share this with someone who would stay up too late watching this. More stories are coming, and if this one is anything to go by, you don't want to miss the next.